9 minutes. That is all it took for Private Daisy Coleman to make every officer on this station forget what they thought they knew about her entire species. My name is Vel Asha. I serve the Verdant Concord as a liaison officer, which means my task is to watch new recruits complete their proving trial and report the results honestly, even when the results make no sense at all. I have overseen 11 trials before hers. None of them prepared me for what I saw on the world called Yisanar. My own people do not fight on the front lines. We are the ones who watch, record, and advise, since our senses are sharp enough to catch details a simple camera might miss, and our patience is long enough to sit through years of careful, uneventful trials without losing focus. I had always considered this a quiet, steady kind of work. I did not expect it to become the most eventful assignment of my life. Let me explain why 9 minutes mattered so much. The Concord is a union of many worlds standing together against something called the Hollow Tide, a slow and hungry darkness that has already swallowed 3 systems at the edge of known space. Every species that joins us must send its soldiers through a proving trial before they are allowed to fight on the front lines. The trial takes place on a world we call a proving ground, a planet touched just enough by the hollow tide that its wildlife has grown aggressive, strange, and very hard to kill. A recruit must survive alone, without a support team, until they reach 50 confirmed kills of dangerous local creatures, along with 1 kill of a true apex predator. We call this number the quota. For every species before humanity, meeting the quota has taken between 1 and 3 years. Recruits usually go in with heavy armor, a medical drone, and a full team of advisors like me, watching every step from orbit. This is not cruelty, it is preparation. The creatures that live on a proving ground carry traces of the same corruption waiting for us in the greater war, so the trial is the closest thing we have to real practice before real losses begin. Earth had only signed the Concord Charter a single year earlier, and already its representatives had made claims that many senior officers considered close to boastful. They said their people would not need the full range of support most recruits required. They said 1 trial world would be more than enough to prove it. High Proctor Sethron, my own superior, had laughed when he first heard this, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who had watched hundreds of confident recruits fail to reach even half the quota in their first year. I had read Earth's file myself, before I ever met her. Humans have no claws worth mentioning, no natural armor, and a bite force lower than half the species already serving beside us. Sethran told me plainly, before the trial began, that humans would likely need the full 3 years, and possibly longer, given how soft their bodies appeared on paper. I met Private Daisy Coleman the morning before she landed on Yisanar. She was a young woman, of average height, with the kind of calm and steady expression I usually only saw on soldiers 3 times her age. I gave her the standard briefing myself. I explained the quota, the dangers of the planet's wildlife, and the full range of support available to her, including a combat exosuit, a drone escort, and a direct medical link back to the station at all times. She listened to every word of it without interrupting. Then she asked if the planet had anything edible. I did not understand the question at first. I told her the local plant life had never been tested for human safety. She nodded, said that was fine, and asked whether the exosuit would slow her down. I told her it would not, since it had been built for speed as much as protection. She thought about this for a moment and said she would rather go without it, since she wanted to move quietly through the terrain, and machines were never quiet. I offered the drone escort a second time, in case she had misunderstood the offer. She declined again, saying she preferred to read the land herself rather than have a machine tell her what to be afraid of. I did not know how to respond to this, so I simply recorded her decision and forwarded it to command, along with a note that the recruit had been given every opportunity to accept support. Command asked me to confirm her decision twice. I confirmed it twice. The next morning, we watched her landing shuttle descend toward the surface of Yisanar from the observation deck above the planet. Yisanar is not a comfortable world to look at. Its sky carries a dull orange haze left behind by centuries of slow corruption, and its forests grow in tangled, restless shapes, as though the trees themselves are listening for something they have not heard yet. Below the tree line ran a river the color of rust, fed by highland streams that never seemed to run clear. The forest itself carried an old Concord name, the Duskwood, though nobody who walked through it for long ever seemed to call it that twice. It is beautiful, the way a closed fist is beautiful. You know there is strength inside it, and you know that strength was never meant for you. Daisy stepped off the shuttle, wearing nothing more than a simple field uniform, a sidearm at her hip, a long knife strapped beside it, and a light pack across her shoulders. She looked up at the orange sky for a moment. The way a person studies weather, they are deciding whether to trust. Then she walked forward into the tree line without a single moment of hesitation. I watched her through the shuttle's remaining sensors, since she carried no drone of her own to give me a closer view. For the first few minutes, she did nothing that seemed remarkable. She walked slowly, testing the ground with each step before placing her full weight on it. She moved around fallen branches instead of over them, avoiding the noise. She kept the wind blowing into her face rather than at her back, so her scent would not carry ahead of her. I remember thinking, watching those first slow steps, that perhaps the file had been right after all, and that whatever had made her superiors so confident might simply take longer to reveal itself than a single morning. The Duskwood does not forgive a careless walker, and for those first few minutes she walked like someone who understood that completely, reading the ground the way a person might read a warning label before opening something they were not quite sure of. Once, something called out from deep in the Duskwood, a long, low sound unlike anything in the Concord's threat catalog. I felt my own skin tighten at the sound, safe as I was, far above the surface. Daisy only tilted her head slightly toward it, marked its direction, and kept walking, as though she were simply noting which way the wind had shifted. I remember feeling a small measure of relief at her caution, thinking that perhaps she would move slowly after all, and that Command's estimate of a long, careful trial might still hold true. Then, at almost exactly 6 minutes, she stopped completely still beside a wide gray rock and did not move again for nearly 2 full minutes. 2 minutes is a long time to stand still on a world like Ysanar. I found myself holding very still in my own chair, as though my own movement, safe in orbit, might somehow give her away. I nearly called out to her over the comm line to ask if something was wrong. Before I could, she moved, low and fast, toward a gap in the brush that my own sensors had not yet flagged as a threat. A full second later, my display finally caught up with what she had already seen: 2 young Scarvith waiting in the gap, the armored pack hunters that make up most of the early danger on Ysanar. They are not the planet's worst creatures, but they are quick, and they almost never hunt alone, using a smaller pair to draw attention while the rest of the pack circles wide. She did not wait to see if the rest of the pack would show itself. She closed the distance before the nearest creature had finished turning to face her, moved past its guard, and ended the encounter in a matter of seconds. The second one broke away and ran. She let it go, watching it vanish into the tree line rather than chase it into ground she had not yet learned. Then she checked the tree line one more time, adjusted the strap on her pack, and kept walking, as if nothing at all worth remembering had just happened. My sensors logged her first confirmed kill at 9 minutes and 4 seconds after she had stepped off the shuttle. I sat alone in the observation deck for a long moment, simply staring at the number glowing on my display. 9 minutes. Most recruits from other worlds spend their first 9 minutes checking their equipment 3 times and asking their support team to confirm the weather forecast. Daisy Coleman had spent hers finding a threat before it had the chance to find her. I sent the report to Command exactly as the sensors had recorded it, without changing a single detail. Within the hour, I received a message asking me to verify the timestamp was correct, followed shortly by a second message asking whether our equipment might be malfunctioning. I checked every system myself. Nothing was malfunctioning. High Proctor Sethrin called me directly that evening. He asked, in a tone I can only describe as carefully controlled disbelief, whether I was certain the recruit had acted entirely alone, without any outside assistance I might have failed to notice. I told him I was certain. I had watched every second of it myself, through my own eyes and my own instruments. He was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. He asked what kind of world produces a soldier capable of that in 9 minutes, with no armor, no support team, and no prior experience of this planet at all. I did not have an answer for him then. I still turn that question over sometimes, even now, long after the trial ended and the rest of the Concord learned exactly what kind of world Earth truly is. I told him what little I could, that she had not seemed nervous during the briefing, only curious, and that curiosity had seemed, at the time, like an odd quality for a soldier walking into a proving trial alone. Sethran did not answer that. He simply asked me to keep the feed open through the night and to notify him directly if anything changed. Nothing changed, not in the way he meant. She did not slow down. She did not call for support, or question her decision to leave the exosuit behind, or show any sign that the weight of what she was doing had begun to settle on her the way it settles on almost every other recruit within the first day. But that first night, all I could do was watch a second number roll onto my display, and then a third, and understand, with a small and steadily growing unease, that 9 minutes had not been luck at all. It had only been a preview of the week to come. By the second hour, I had stopped expecting the number to slow down. Daisy moved through the duskwood at a steady pace, pausing only when the terrain demanded it. She did not celebrate the first kill, and she did not appear shaken by it either. She simply kept walking, reading the ground the way the rest of us read a report, searching for the next problem before it became one. The real test of the first day came just after midday when she crossed into a wide clearing ringed by broken stone, the kind of place our threat maps had already flagged as a common Scarveth gathering ground. I watched her slow before she ever reached the tree line at its edge, crouching low to study the open space beyond it. I understood why a moment later, when my sensors finally caught what she had already guessed. 6 Scarveth moved along the far tree line, not 2 this time, a full hunting pack with an older, larger animal at its center that the Concord threat catalog marks with its own separate warning. Packs like this are the reason most recruits spend their first full month on a proving ground, simply learning to avoid open ground entirely. Daisy did not avoid it. She studied it. For nearly 10 minutes, she stayed at the tree line, watching the pack move, tracking which animals hung back and which pushed forward, learning the shape of their formation the way a person learns the shape of a room before turning off the light. I found myself holding still in my chair again, the way I had during her first encounter, as though my own stillness could somehow protect her from a threat that was still an entire world away from me. I asked her once, quietly, over the comm line, what exactly she was counting. She said she was not counting the pack at all. She was counting the gaps between them, the moments when one animal's attention drifted toward another instead of toward the open ground ahead of it. Every pack, she said, has a rhythm, and every rhythm has a weak beat somewhere inside it, if a person is patient enough to wait for it to show itself. I wrote that down afterward, word for word, since it seemed like the kind of thing worth remembering. When she finally moved, she did not go toward the pack. She circled wide around the clearing instead, staying inside the tree line, until she reached a narrow gap between 2 broken stones on the pack's flank, a gap barely wide enough for one creature to pass through at a time. Only then did she make herself known, drawing their attention with a thrown stone rather than her own voice or scent. The pack answered exactly as packs do, all 6 of them turning at once and closing in fast. But a pack that must funnel through a narrow gap to reach its target is no longer 6 threats at once. It is one threat, repeated 6 times, each one arriving a half second after the last. I will not describe every moment of what followed in detail, since detail was never the point. What mattered was the shape of it. She let the gap do the work the pack itself could not undo, meeting each animal as it arrived rather than all of them together, moving her feet more than her hands, spending exactly as much effort as each moment required, and no more. The older, larger animal at the center of the pack reached her last, after its 5 packmates had already fallen or fled, and by then it was facing a fight it could not win alone either. When it was over, 4 Scarvith lay still. 1 had fled back into the duskwood, and the older animal had broken off entirely, retreating rather than risk what its pack had already lost. Daisy stood at the narrow gap for a moment, breathing harder than she had all morning, before she stepped through it and began walking again. The confirmed count reached 5 before the first day had even ended. Command's messages changed tone after that. The disbelief in them did not disappear, but a new note entered alongside it, something closer to alarm. I received 3 separate requests that evening, asking whether the observation feed could be shared more widely across the Concord network. I forwarded the requests to Sethran, since that decision was above my rank, and he approved every one of them without comment. By nightfall on the first day, 7 Concord worlds had active viewers on the feed. By the end of the second day, that number had more than tripled. Daisy made camp that first night beside the largest of the fallen Scarvith, using its broad, armored body as a windbreak against the cold air rolling down from the highlands. She built a small fire from dry brush, ate something from her pack that did not need cooking, and spoke to Captain Oliver Bennett, the human officer assigned to keep a comm line open with her from our station, for a little under 10 minutes before she went quiet for the night. I listened to the recording of that conversation more than once afterward. Bennett asked how she was holding up. She said she was fine, that the wildlife here was honestly kind of relaxing compared to some of the places she had grown up hiking through. Bennett laughed, the kind of laugh a person gives when they are not entirely sure if the other person is joking. I was fairly certain, even then, that she was not. He asked her, half joking, whether she missed home yet. She said a little, mostly the quiet parts, and that the fire helped with that more than anything else. She said her grandfather used to build one just like it, small and low, more for company than for warmth, and that some habits simply followed a person wherever they went, even to a world this far from anywhere familiar. It was the first time I had heard her mention anything about her life before the Concord, and I found myself listening more closely than my duties strictly required. Above her, the orange haze of Isanar's sky had faded into a deep, bruised violet, and somewhere out in the dark beyond the firelight, something moved through the underbrush and thought better of it. Daisy did not look up from the fire. She simply noted the direction the sound had come from, the way she noted everything, and let it pass. The second day brought a different kind of test. The Scarvith packs near the clearing had learned something from the day before, whether through instinct or memory I still do not know, and they no longer gathered in open ground where a single hunter could study their formation from a distance. Instead, they moved through the duskwood itself, using the tangled trees the same way Daisy had used the narrow gap, turning the terrain into a weapon aimed back at her. For the first time since the trial began, I watched something that genuinely frightened me. She was crossing a stretch of dense trees around mid-morning when 3 Scarvith came at her from 3 different directions at once, close enough together that there was no clean order to meet them in, no narrow gap to funnel them through. For a handful of seconds, she was simply surrounded, with nothing to do but decide, instantly, which threat mattered most in that exact moment, and trust that decision completely. I do not know how to explain what she did next, except to say that she seemed to stop thinking about the pack as a group at all, and started treating each animal as its own separate problem, solved the instant it presented itself, with no attention wasted on the 2 that had not yet arrived. It should not have worked. On paper, surrounded by 3 coordinated predators with no terrain advantage, it should not have worked at all. It worked. When it was over, she had a shallow cut along one forearm, the first injury of the entire trial, which she cleaned and wrapped herself without once mentioning it over the comm line. I only learned about it because our sensors track basic vital signs, and Bennett noticed the small spike in her recorded heart rate before she calmly explained it away as nothing worth reporting. The confirmed count reached 14 by the end of the second day. The third day did not bring any single dramatic encounter the way the first 2 had. Instead, it brought a steady, grinding accumulation of smaller ones, the kind that never would have made an official report on their own, but added up, hour after hour, into something the whole station could not stop watching. A lone Scarvith scout caught crossing a stream, a pair working a game trail she happened to cross before they crossed her. A third animal that made the mistake of testing her from behind a fallen log, not realizing she had already marked the log an hour earlier as the only cover for 100 paces in either direction. None of these took long. None of them seemed to cost her anything beyond a few minutes of her day. But each one added a single digit to the display in the observation deck, and by the middle of the afternoon, watching that display had become something close to a ritual for everyone on shift, a slow, steady climb that nobody wanted to look away from for long enough to miss the next number. By the third day, something had shifted in how the entire station watched her. Officers who had never expressed interest in a proving trial before began appearing in the observation deck during her active hours. Delegates from other Concord worlds sent formal requests to speak with me directly, asking questions I did not always have good answers for. Is this recruit unusually gifted, even among her own people? Is this the average outcome we should expect from Earth going forward? I answered honestly each time. I did not know yet. Nobody did. One delegate, a sharp-eyed representative named Cor Vantis, from a world that had lost an entire recruit generation to its own proving trial decades earlier, asked me a different question than the rest. He wanted to know how she slept at night, doing this alone. I told him, as best I could, that she seemed to sleep exactly the way anyone sleeps after a long day of ordinary work. He did not seem to find that reassuring. I am not certain I did either. Another officer, one I had worked alongside for years without ever hearing her voice raised, asked whether it was possible the recruit simply did not understand the danger she was in, and whether someone ought to explain it to her more plainly before something finally caught up with her. I told her, honestly, that I had explained the danger myself, in full, before the trial ever began, and that Daisy had listened to every word of it. She had simply not seemed frightened by any of it, then or since. The officer did not have a response to that either. Daisy herself seemed entirely unaware of how much attention she had gathered, or simply unbothered by it. She continued moving through the duskwood at the same steady pace, handling each new threat as it appeared, resting when the terrain allowed it, eating when she was hungry, and treating every conversation over the comm line as though she were speaking to a friend checking in, rather than an entire alliance of worlds watching her every move. By the close of the third day, the confirmed count stood at 24. Half the quota in under 72 hours, without armor, without a team, and without a single moment that command could point to as luck rather than skill. I remember writing that number into my report and sitting with it for a long time before sending it onward. 24 confirmed kills in 3 days was not simply an impressive number. It was a number that made every year, every careful multi-year trial the Concord had ever run for any other species look less like caution and more like habit. A habit nobody had ever bothered to question until now. I thought, as I wrote it, of my own species trial, conducted 3 centuries ago, back when the Concord itself was still young, and the hollow tide was still considered a distant problem for someone else's grandchildren to solve. Our own record showed an average of just over 2 years per recruit, with losses along the way that the histories mention only in passing. The way old wounds are mentioned once healing has made them easier to discuss. I had never once questioned whether 2 years was simply what the process required. Watching Daisy's count climb past 20 on a single display, I found myself questioning it for the first time in my life. Sethran read the report and said nothing for almost a full day. When he finally called me, his first question was not about the number at all. He asked, quietly, whether I thought she would slow down once the terrain grew harder, once she reached the parts of Yisanar that had broken far stronger recruits from far older worlds. I told him I did not know. I told him I was beginning to suspect the terrain would need to work considerably harder than it had so far. I was right to suspect it. What waited for her beyond the duskwood was nothing like the pack hunters she had already learned to read. It was patient in a way the Scarveth never were, hidden in a way nothing in the clearing had been, and it was only the first of two very different dangers waiting for her before the week was through. That night, before she finally let the fire burn low and closed her eyes for the first real rest since landing, she asked me a question of her own for the first time since the trial began. She wanted to know what came after the duskwood, not the threat catalog version, but what it actually looked like, since maps and numbers rarely told a person what a place felt like to stand inside. I told her, as honestly as I could, that I did not fully know, since no liaison officer assigned to a human trial had ever needed to describe it before. She considered that for a moment, then said that was fine, and that she would rather see it for herself anyway. I believed her completely, and I was not entirely sure, lying awake myself long after her fire had gone dark on my display, whether that belief comforted me or not. The duskwood ended the way a held breath ends, all at once, the tangled trees giving way to a flat stretch of pale, cracked ground that our charts called the Grey Reach. I did not like the Grey Reach from the moment I saw it. Nothing grew taller than a person's knee across its entire visible length, and what did grow had the color of old bone rather than any living green. The corruption of the hollow tide sits closer to the surface here than almost anywhere else on Yisanar, and it shows in the ground itself, in the strange stillness of the air, in the complete absence of the small, ordinary sounds that had followed Daisy through the duskwood. She noticed the silence before I did. She stopped at the tree line, the same way she had stopped before the clearing on the first day, and studied the open ground for a long while before she ever set foot on it. I asked her, over the comm line, what she was looking for. She said she was not looking for anything yet. She was listening for what was missing. I did not understand what she meant until she explained it a moment later, in the same plain tone she used for everything. Small things, she said. Insects, low animals, the little creatures that fill in the space beneath larger predators, always go quiet near something that hunts by staying still. If the ground looked empty but felt wrong, that usually meant it was not empty at all. I had never thought of silence as a kind of evidence before that day. In all my training, danger had always announced itself through motion, sound, some change a sensor could register and label. She was teaching me, without ever meaning to, that the absence of those things could matter just as much as their presence. I checked our threat catalog while she waited. The Grey Reach is home to a creature we call the Thornback, a low, wide predator built almost entirely for patience, colored so close to the pale ground beneath it that most recruits from other worlds never see one until it has already decided to move. It does not chase. It does not need to. It simply waits, sometimes for days, until something walks close enough, and then it closes the distance in less time than it takes to notice the ground itself had shifted. Daisy crossed the Grey Reach anyway, but not in a straight line. She moved in a slow, patient zigzag, testing small sections of ground with a thrown stone before she ever stepped there herself, watching for any patch that did not respond quite the way the rest of the ground did. She found it a little past midday, a shallow rise no different in color from anything around it, except that a stone thrown near it landed with a slightly different sound than the stones she had thrown before. She stopped well outside of it and waited, still as the ground itself, for nearly 20 minutes. I have never found 20 minutes difficult to sit through in my life until that day. On my display, nothing about the rise ever changed. No motion, no heat signature strong enough to separate it from the sun-warmed ground around it, nothing a sensor could point to and call proof. I began to wonder if she had simply misjudged an ordinary stone, if the whole long pause was built on nothing more than a sound that only seemed different in her own memory. I did not say this to her. I only watched, and waited, and found myself doubting a judgment that had not once been wrong so far. When she finally moved again, she did not walk toward the rise. She circled it slowly, at a distance she clearly judged to be just outside its reach, until she found a low, flat stone she could lift with one hand. She threw it, not at the rise, but just past it, close enough to fall within what she must have guessed was its strike range. The ground came apart. What had looked like a shallow rise unfolded into something far larger than I expected, low and wide and pale, driving forward in a single explosive motion toward the place the stone had landed, fully committed to a strike aimed at nothing at all. By the time it understood its mistake, Daisy was already moving, closing the distance it had just spent itself covering, meeting it in the one brief window before its long body could gather itself for a second effort. The engagement lasted only a few seconds longer. When it ended, she stood over the still shape of the thornback, breathing evenly, and said nothing at all over the comm line for almost a full minute. Bennett finally asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. She said patient things were easier than fast things, once you understood that patience only worked as long as nobody made it move first. The confirmed count reached 31 by the end of that day. She rested that night at the edge of the gray reach, close enough to the tree line that a little green still clung to the world around her, and told Bennett, when he asked, that the thornback had been the strangest thing she had faced so far, not because it was dangerous, but because it asked for a different kind of courage than the rest. Running toward 6, Scarveth took one kind of nerve, she said, standing still for 20 minutes, waiting for a threat to make the first mistake, took a completely different kind, and she was not sure which one came harder to most people. I found myself agreeing with her, though I did not say so at the time. Ambassador Ethra, a representative from one of the Concord's founding worlds, requested a formal briefing from me that same evening. She did not ask about tactics or numbers the way most of the others had. She asked, carefully, what this meant for the balance of the Concord itself, now that the newest member appeared capable of something none of the founding species had ever demonstrated. I told her, honestly, that I did not yet know. I am not certain she found that answer any more comforting than I did. The Grey Reach gave way, over the following day, to a different kind of ground entirely, a long stretch of broken cliffs and narrow ridgelines that our charts called the high steps. I expected, given everything I had seen so far, that whatever waited there would simply be another version of a problem she had already solved. I was wrong, and so, for a short time, was she. The high steps belonged to a creature called the Windclaw, a flying predator with a wingspan wider than a person is tall, built for a single devastating dive from height rather than any kind of sustained pursuit. It does not stalk the way the thornback does. It watches from far above, patient in its own way, and waits for a single clear moment when its target has no cover above them at all. Daisy understood the shape of this threat quickly, staying close to the cliff walls and beneath outcroppings wherever she could, denying it a clean angle. For most of the morning, this worked exactly as she intended. It stopped working the moment she had to cross a wide, open ledge with no cover above it at all, a gap in the cliff face too broad to avoid and too narrow to easily reroute around without losing most of the day. I saw the Windclaw a full 2 seconds before she did, a dark shape folding its wings against the pale sky, already committed to its dive. I called out over the comm line, though I do not think there was any real chance my warning reached her in time to matter. She was already moving before I finished speaking, throwing herself sideways rather than forward, which was, I understand now, exactly the wrong direction for the Windclaw to expect. It was not quite enough. The dive caught her along the shoulder rather than the clean ending strike it had aimed for, tearing through the fabric of her jacket and drawing a thin line of blood before its own momentum carried it past her, too fast to correct course in the open air. I do not think I have ever been more afraid during any part of the trial than I was in the half-second after that strike landed, before I understood that she was still moving, still upright, and already turning to track where the creature would need to come around for a second pass. She did not wait for the second pass to happen on the Windclaw's terms. She moved fast toward the nearest section of overhang, narrow enough that the creature's wide wings could not follow her beneath it, and waited there, one hand pressed briefly against her shoulder until the Windclaw was forced to commit to a narrower, slower approach along the only angle left to it. That approach was its last mistake. By the time it came close enough to try again, it had lost the one advantage that made it dangerous at all: height and space enough to build real speed, and Daisy no longer needed either patience or a plan more complicated than being exactly where the terrain had already promised to put her. She wrapped the wound on her shoulder herself that evening, using supplies from her own pack, and told Bennett over the comm line that it was shallow enough not to need reporting as anything beyond routine. Our own sensors disagreed slightly with her assessment, though not enough for command to order an early extraction, a decision I privately found more difficult to accept than she seemed to. I asked her, once the wound was cleaned and wrapped, whether she wanted to reconsider the exosuit after all, now that she had felt what these creatures were capable of at their fastest. She said no, in the same easy tone she used for most things, and added that a scratch was simply the cost of learning a new kind of ground. She said she would rather carry a lesson than a machine. The confirmed count reached 38 by the end of that day. That night, unable to sleep in any way my own species would recognize as rest, I found myself reading through Earth's historical records for the first time since the trial began, searching for some explanation my training had never given me. What I found did not fully explain her, but it began to explain the shape of the world that made her. Earth had passed through long ages of extreme cold, forcing its people to survive alongside creatures far larger and far more dangerous than themselves, long before any of them carried a single weapon more advanced than a sharpened stone. Entire branches of larger, stronger predators had gone extinct on that world, while the smaller, softer species that shared their forests and plains had not only survived, but spread across nearly every corner of the planet that could support them at all. I remember sitting with that thought for a long time. The Concord had always measured a species by its claws, its armor, its raw physical strength. Earth's own history suggested a different measurement entirely, one built from patience, adaptation, and an old, practiced familiarity with sharing ground with things that could kill you. I found, too, brief mentions of how recently much of that history had ended, at least by the standards my own species uses to measure such things. Humans had only stopped needing to face down large, dangerous animals as a matter of routine survival a short while before they began building the machines that eventually carried them off their own world entirely. The knowledge Daisy carried, I realized, was not some ancient, half-forgotten instinct passed down across countless generations. It was close enough to living memory that her own grandfather, the same one who had taught her to build a small fire for company rather than warmth, might well have carried some version of it himself. I requested a private line with Daisy the following morning, during one of her rest periods, separate from the official record. I asked her plainly why this was easy for her, when it had taken every other species we had ever tested years to accomplish what she was close to finishing in days. She considered the question the way a person considers a remark about the weather, unhurried, almost amused. She told me she had grown up somewhere with real winters and real wildlife, a place where her family had taught her to track, to hunt for food rather than sport, and to read the signs a forest gives before it decides to hurt you. She said the details out here were different, the shapes and the colors and the names, but the underlying pattern was not so different from home. She said, quite simply, that she had grown up around dangerous animals long before anyone told her that made her unusual. I asked if she had ever been afraid, out there among the trees and the cliffs, entirely alone. She thought about this for longer than she had thought about anything else I had asked her. She said fear had never been the problem. Being careless was the problem. Fear, used correctly, was just another sense, telling you where to look next. I did not have a response to that. I still do not, fully, though I have thought about it often since. She asked me a question of her own, before the line closed, one I had not expected. She wanted to know if my own people had a proving trial of their own, somewhere back at the beginning of the Concord, before the founding worlds had settled into the careful roles they occupied now. I told her we did. 3 centuries passed, conducted on a world not so different from Isanar. She asked how long it had taken my people, on average, to finish it. I told her, and watched her expression change for just a moment, not with judgment, but with something closer to quiet surprise, as though she had not considered that the entire Concord had once stood exactly where Earth stood now, uncertain and unproven, before any of its worlds had earned the confidence they carried today. By the close of the 5th day, the confirmed count stood at 40, 10 short of the full quota, with only the apex requirement still unmet. Command sent word that evening, suggesting she could complete the remaining 10 kills among the smaller threats still scattered across the Grey Reach and the high steppes, avoiding the planet's single most dangerous resident entirely. It was, technically, a valid path to finishing the trial. Nobody would have questioned it, given everything she had already proven. Daisy declined the suggestion without much discussion. She said finishing the quota without addressing the one threat every other recruit on this world had been warned away from felt like leaving the job half done, and she did not care for leaving jobs half done. She said it plainly, without any performance in her voice, the way a person turns down a shortcut on a task they have already decided to finish properly. She asked instead for the full threat profile on Yisanar's apex predator, a creature the Concord's own records referred to, without much affection, as the matriarch. I sent her everything we had. It was not, I suspected even then, going to be enough. She spent that final evening, before entering the matriarch's territory, doing very little that seemed remarkable. She checked the edge of her knife against her thumb, adjusted the straps of her pack, and ate slowly, without any particular urgency, as though she were preparing for an ordinary day of work, rather than the most dangerous stretch of ground on the entire planet. Bennett asked if she wanted anything sent down ahead of her, any additional supplies or equipment now that the apex threat was close. She said no. She said she had everything she needed, and that anything more would only be something else to carry. As she turned away from the high steps and began moving toward the deep canyon system where the matriarch made her home, the air itself seemed to change around her, the faint orange haze thickening into something heavier, something that clung rather than drifted. I do not know if she felt it the way I did, watching from above. I only know that for the first time since her trial began, I found myself hoping, quietly and without much confidence, that patience and terrain and old family lessons about winter forests would be enough for whatever waited for her at the bottom of that canyon. By then, the observation feed had grown far beyond anything a single liaison officer was meant to manage alone. Sethrin had assigned 2 additional officers to help monitor incoming requests, and still the queue of Concord worlds asking for direct access grew faster than any of us could answer it. I remember thinking, as I watched Daisy's small figure cross the last stretch of broken stone before the ground finally dropped away into shadow, that whatever happened next would not simply be recorded for a single trial file somewhere in Concord archives. It would be watched, live, by more of the galaxy than any proving trial in living memory, founding worlds included. The canyon did not look like the rest of Yisanar. It looked like a wound that had never fully closed. Our charts called it the Scar, and the name suited it better than most Concord names suit anything. It dropped away from the high steps in a single long fracture, its walls streaked with a faint, sourceless glow that our instruments measured as residual corruption, old and deep and settled, the way rot settles into wood long after the tree itself has fallen. Nothing grew along its floor. Nothing needed to. The matriarch had claimed this ground for longer than the Concord had kept records of this world at all, and everything else on Yisanar had learned, over generations, to leave it entirely to her. I pulled every record we had on her before Daisy reached the canyon rim. There was not much to find, and what little existed was not encouraging. 3 years earlier, a full platoon of 12 recruits from a Concord founding world had entered the Scar together, fully armored, fully supported, under direct orders to thin the region's threat population before their own trials continued elsewhere. They had retreated within a single day, having lost 2 of their own, without ever landing a confirmed strike against the matriarch herself. No recruit, from any world, had ever taken her alone. Beyond that single failed attempt, the records held only fragments. Second-hand reports from survey drones that had ventured too close to the canyon rim and returned with damaged sensors, and a handful of accounts from earlier, smaller expeditions that had never gone as far as the canyon floor at all. Every account agreed on one point. The matriarch did not behave like the rest of Yisanar's wildlife. She did not simply react to threats. She appeared, in every recorded instance, to consider them first. I did not share that last detail with Daisy before she began her descent. I am still not certain whether that was caution or cowardice on my part, and I have not fully resolved the question even now. I told Daisy all of this before she began her descent. I felt it was owed to her, whatever else happened next. She listened, without any change in her expression, the same calm attention she gave every briefing before it. When I finished, she asked only one question. She asked whether the platoon that failed had tried to fight the matriarch on the matriarch's own ground, in the open canyon floor where her size and speed gave her every advantage, or whether they had tried to choose their own ground instead. I checked the old records again. They had gone in through the widest, most direct approach, the fastest route to covering territory as ordered. They had never tried to choose the ground at all. Daisy nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. She said she did not intend to make the same mistake, and that the ground itself, more than any weapon she carried, would decide how the next day went. She spent the better part of a full day simply watching the scar from its rim before she ever set foot inside it, tracking the matriarch's movements at a distance through the gaps in the canyon's broken walls. She marked the times the matriarch drank from a dark pool near the canyon's center, the paths she favored along the broken walls, and the wide, unhurried loop she walked each time she circled her own territory, as though even an apex predator needed the comfort of a familiar routine. Patterns, Daisy told me once that day, were the one thing every living creature carried with it, no matter how dangerous, and the scar's only true resident was, in the end, still a living creature. I asked her, toward the end of that long day of watching, whether she had found anything the old records had missed. She said only one thing, quietly, almost to herself. She said the matriarch never walked the same stretch of canyon floor, twice in a row, without pausing to look back the way she had come, as if some old memory of being hunted herself had never quite left her, even after claiming this entire canyon as her own. I did not know what to do with that observation at the time. I think of it often now. By the time she finally began her descent, she had chosen her ground carefully, a narrow stretch near the canyon's northern wall where a natural choke point forced anything moving through it into a single line, too tight for the matriarch's full stride, too enclosed for her to easily turn once committed to a charge. I do not know how she convinced the matriarch to notice her at all, since nothing in Daisy's approach seemed built to draw attention. I only know that within an hour of her entering the canyon floor, something vast moved along the far wall, and every viewer on the feed, and there were many now, went completely silent at once. I was aware, in the periphery of my attention, that the observation deck around me had filled with more officers than I had ever seen gathered in one place, Sethrin among them, standing very still near the back of the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody so much as shifted their weight. It occurred to me, distantly, that an entire section of the Concorde's command structure had gathered to watch one recruit stand alone in a canyon, and that not one of them seemed to know what they were hoping to see. The matriarch was larger than our records had suggested, low and powerful, moving with a controlled, unhurried grace that made her previous kills, even the largest Scarvith, look almost clumsy by comparison. Her hide carried the same faint, sourceless glow as the canyon walls around her, as though the corruption she had lived alongside for so long had simply become part of her rather than something she merely endured. Old scars marked her shoulders and flank, evidence of a long life spent surviving challenges far less patient than the one she now faced. She did not charge immediately. She circled instead, at a distance, studying Daisy the same careful way Daisy had spent the previous day studying her. For a long, tense stretch, neither of them moved first. I watched Daisy's stance through the long silence that followed, low and balanced, her weight settled evenly rather than leaning toward either retreat or attack. She did not raise her sidearm. She did not reach for her knife. She simply watched the matriarch circle, the same unhurried patience she had shown at the canyon rim the day before, as though the two of them had all the time in the galaxy to decide who would move first, and neither intended to waste it. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper a question to no one in particular, asking why she had not simply opened fire the moment the matriarch came into range. I did not answer. I suspect Daisy would have told them that a wounded, angry apex predator on open ground was a considerably worse problem than a patient one still deciding whether a fight was worth having at all. It was the matriarch who broke first. Not with the direct charge Daisy had prepared for, but with a sudden shift toward a second, wider gap in the canyon wall, one that would have let her flank around Daisy's chosen choke point entirely and reach open ground on the other side of it. I realized, watching it happen, that the platoon 3 years earlier had likely made a different mistake than the obvious one. They had not simply chosen the wrong ground. They had also underestimated how well this creature understood ground at all. Daisy realized it too, a half-second later than I would have liked, and had to move fast to cut off the wider gap before the matriarch reached it, abandoning the safety of her chosen choke point to do it. For a handful of seconds, the fight became exactly the kind of fight the 12 recruit platoon had lost. Open ground, full size and speed, on the matriarch's side, no terrain doing any of the work for her at all. I have rarely felt as helpless as I did in those seconds, watching from so far above, with no way to reach her, and nothing useful left to say over the comm line. The matriarch closed the distance between them far faster than her size should have allowed, and for a moment, Daisy was moving backward rather than forward, giving ground she had spent an entire day refusing to give, searching the broken stone around her for anything that might still serve as an advantage now that her original plan had come apart. I found myself, in that moment, doing something I had not done since long before I accepted this post, something closer to a wish than a plan, hoping without any real basis for it that 7 days of proof would not end in the one outcome none of us had allowed ourselves to consider. Behind me, I heard Sethran say her name once, quietly, not as an order, since there was no order left that could have reached her in time to matter, but simply as a sound, the way a person says a name when there is nothing else left to do with their fear. She did not try to outfight the matriarch on open ground. She used the one thing the creature had not accounted for, the same narrow choke points she had abandoned to cut off the flank, now positioned behind her rather than ahead of her. She let the matriarch's own charge carry her forward, past the wider gap, back toward the exact narrow stretch Daisy had chosen from the very beginning, simply approaching it from the opposite direction than either of them had originally planned. The choke point did not care which direction anything approached it from. It was still too narrow for the matriarch's full stride, still too enclosed for a clean turn, regardless of which way the charge had begun. What followed lasted only a short while, though it felt considerably longer to everyone watching from the safety of orbit. The matriarch reached the narrow stretch at full speed, committed entirely to the charge, with no room left along the enclosed walls to turn aside or slow herself, even if some old, cautious instinct had told her to try. Daisy met her there, at the single point in the entire canyon where speed and size mattered least and precision mattered most, where a creature built for open ground finally ran out of room to be everything that made her dangerous in the first place. I will not describe the final exchange in detail, the same way I chose not to describe the pack encounter on the first day. It is enough to say that it was over quickly, that it required every ounce of patience Daisy had spent the last 2 days building, and that it was decided, in the end, by ground chosen carefully, rather than strength spent recklessly. When it ended, the canyon fell into a silence deeper than any I had heard since the trial began. Nothing moved along the scar's ancient walls. Nothing on the feed, across every world watching, made a single sound either. I looked around the observation deck and saw officers from species I had known for years standing with an expression I had never once seen on any of them before. Something between disbelief and a kind of quiet grief, as though they were mourning an old certainty rather than celebrating a victory. Daisy stood alone at the narrow choke point for a long moment, breathing hard, one hand braced against the canyon wall beside her. She did not celebrate. She did not call out to Bennett or to me right away. She simply stood there, in the quiet, the way a person stands after finishing a long day of difficult, necessary work, looking back once, briefly, toward the open ground she had given up and reclaimed within the same few minutes, as though checking the shape of what had just happened against the plan she had carried into the canyon a full day earlier. I glanced toward the back of the observation deck without quite meaning to. Sethrin had not moved from where he stood, but something in his posture had changed, a tension I had not noticed leaving him until it was already gone. When she finally spoke, it was to ask, quite plainly, whether the confirmation had registered on our end, since her own equipment, simple as it was, had nothing left to tell her one way or another. I checked the display myself before I answered her. 50 confirmed kills. 1 apex kill, the first ever recorded solo against this creature, by any recruit, from any world, in the entire history of the Concord's proving trials. 7 days, not years. 7 days, from the moment her shuttle had touched down to the moment the scar fell silent around her. I read the number back to her, over the comm line, slowly, the way a person reads something they want to be certain they have not misread, and for a moment, neither of us said anything else at all. Somewhere behind me, I heard the low murmur of an entire observation deck finally beginning to exhale, officers turning to one another, a dozen quiet conversations starting at once in a dozen different languages, none of them quite loud enough yet to reach the volume the moment probably deserved. Then she asked, in the same easy voice she had used to ask about edible plants on her very first morning, whether anyone back at the station had something decent to eat, because she was, by her own account, absolutely starving. I laughed. I am not entirely certain my own species is meant to laugh quite the way I did in that moment, but I did it anyway, alone in the observation deck, with an entire canyon of stunned silence still glowing faintly on the screen in front of me. Somewhere in that laugh, I think, was every unanswered question Sethrin had asked me across the past 7 days, and every answer I had never quite managed to give him, finally arriving all at once, far too large for a single word to hold. The silence in the observation deck broke all at once, the way a held breath finally breaks, into a wave of voices that no comm protocol I knew of was built to handle cleanly. I do not think I can fully describe the following hour, except to say that every screen in the room seemed to be speaking at once. Delegates from a dozen Concord worlds requested direct contact within minutes of the confirmation appearing on the shared feed. Officers who had never once acknowledged my reports personally sent messages asking for details I had already included in writing hours earlier. Somewhere beneath all of it, quietly, I found myself simply grateful that Daisy herself was no longer standing alone in a canyon, and was instead already making her way back toward the extraction point Bennett had arranged the moment the confirmation registered. Sethrin found me before I found him. He did not say anything at first. He simply stood beside me at the main display, looking at the final number the way a person looks at a message they have read correctly, but still cannot quite believe. When he finally spoke, he asked whether I had prepared the formal report yet. I told him I had not, that I had barely had time to process the number myself, let alone write anything worth submitting to the wider Concord. He nodded, slowly, and said that whatever I wrote would likely be read more widely and argued over more thoroughly than anything either of us had put our names to before. He did not say this as a warning. I understood it, instead, as something closer to respect. Ambassador Ethra requested a formal session within the same day, exactly as I had expected she would after our earlier conversation. The session was not simple. Several delegates raised the obvious question first, whether Daisy Coleman represented an extraordinary individual or a genuine average for her species, since the answer to that single question would reshape every assumption the Concord had built around its newest ally. Others raised a quieter, more uncomfortable question beneath it, one I do not think anybody wanted to say plainly in front of the full assembly. If humanity's average recruit could do even a fraction of what we had just watched, what did that mean for the careful, multi-year training structures every founding world had relied on for generations? A third voice, one I had not expected to speak at all during that session, belonged to a quiet, cautious delegate named Proctor DeMille, from a world that had joined the Concord long before Earth and had built much of its standing on the strength of its own proving trial record. He asked, carefully, what would happen to that standing now, if a newer, smaller ally had simply outperformed generations of careful preparation in a single week? Nobody answered him directly. I noticed, though, that nobody dismissed the question either. Cor Vantis spoke during that session, in a way I had not expected from him. He reminded the assembly, gently, that his own world had lost an entire generation of recruits to their first proving trial, decades before humanity had ever joined the Concord Charter, and that he had asked me, only days earlier, how this one recruit managed to sleep at night doing what she did, alone. He said he no longer thought that was the right question to have asked. He said the better question, the one none of them had considered yet, was what it might mean for the war itself, if a species existed that treated a proving ground the way the rest of them treated routine training. Someone raised, quietly, the matter of the three systems the Hollow Tide had already claimed before any of this began, and the slow, grinding timeline the Concord had built for retaking them, a timeline measured in decades rather than years. Nobody suggested, not yet, that timeline might now be worth revisiting entirely. But I noticed several delegates writing that thought down anyway, in whatever manner their own species used to hold on to an idea they were not yet ready to say aloud. A younger delegate, seated near the back of the chamber and not yet senior enough to be expected to speak at all, asked a question that seemed to catch even the assembly's most experienced voices off guard. She asked whether the Concord had ever considered that its own caution, however well earned, might have cost more than it had ever saved, across 3 centuries of careful trials and careful timelines. Nobody answered her either, though I noted that Ambassador Ithra looked at her for a long moment afterward, the way a person looks at someone who has just said something they wished they had said first. Nobody had a comfortable answer to any of it. I am not certain, even now, that a comfortable answer exists. While the assembly debated implications I still do not feel fully qualified to judge, Daisy herself was doing something considerably simpler. She was eating. I found her, once my own duties finally allowed it, in the station's small recovery wing, seated at a table with Bennett across from her and a tray of food in front of her that she was working through with the same steady, unhurried focus she had given every threat on Yisanar. Colonel Grace Whitfield, the senior human officer overseeing Earth's early Concord postings, had arrived from a nearby vessel to conduct the formal debrief, and stood nearby reviewing a datapad, though she glanced up when I entered. I asked Daisy how she felt, now that it was finished. She said she felt tired, mostly, and that the food on the station was better than she expected, though nothing beat a proper meal back home. She did not mention the matriarch by name. She did not seem inclined to dwell on any single moment of the past 7 days more than any other. Colonel Whitfield asked her, more formally, whether she had any concerns about her performance being used as a benchmark for future recruits. Daisy considered this for a moment, the same unhurried consideration she gave everything, and said she hoped nobody planned to use her as an average, since she suspected plenty of people back home could have done the same thing, or something close to it, given the chance. She said this without any obvious modesty in her tone, simply as a plain statement of fact, the way she said most things. Colonel Whitfield studied her for a long moment, then asked, more gently than her earlier questions, whether Daisy had a message she wanted passed along to Earth, now that the whole Concord knew her name. Daisy thought about it, then said to tell her family she was fine, that the food was decent, and that she would call properly once she had a night of real sleep behind her. It was, I understood even then, exactly the kind of message that would mean far more to the people waiting for it than any official statement the Concorde could draft on her behalf. I asked, because I could not quite help myself, whether she had been afraid at any point during those 7 days. Truly afraid, in the way I understood the word. She thought about it for longer than she had thought about almost anything else I had asked her across the entire trial. She said there had been moments, certainly, the open ground against the matriarch chief among them, where things could easily have gone differently. She said fear had shown up right on schedule in those moments, exactly as it always did, and that she had simply done what she always did with it, listened to what it was telling her, and kept moving anyway. Bennett, quieter than usual, asked what she planned to do next, now that the trial was behind her. She said she would go wherever the Concorde needed her, same as before, though she admitted, with the first real trace of humor I had heard from her since the debrief began, that she hoped her next assignment came with slightly better weather. Colonel Whitfield finally set down her datapad and asked one more question, one that seemed to have been sitting behind her more formal ones the entire time. She asked whether Daisy had any advice for the recruits who would follow her, the ones command was already beginning to select back on Earth. Daisy thought about it for a while, longer than she had thought about any of the Colonel's earlier questions, and said only that they should not try to be braver than they actually were. She said bravery that came from pretending was the kind that got a person killed on a world like Ysanar, but bravery that came from simply paying close attention and trusting what that attention told you was the kind that brought a person home again. She said it was not a complicated lesson, but it was one most people had to learn the hard way before it stuck. Bennett wrote that down, word for word, on the small notepad he carried everywhere out of habit rather than necessity. I noticed, later, that his official summary of the debrief included it exactly as she had said it, without a single word changed. I left the recovery wing that evening and returned to my own quarters, intending to finally write the report Sethran had asked for. I found I could not begin it right away. I sat instead, with everything I had watched over the past 7 days, turning it over slowly, the way Daisy herself seemed to turn over every question anyone asked her. I thought about the file I had read before ever meeting her, the one that measured humans by claws they did not have and armor they did not wear, and found bite force listed as though it were the only number that mattered. I thought about High Proctor Sethran's early certainty that humans would need the full 3 years, possibly longer, and about how carefully, quietly wrong that certainty had turned out to be. I thought about 11 previous trials I had personally overseen, each one careful and slow and supported by every resource the Concorde could offer, and about how none of them had prepared me, even slightly, for 9 minutes on the first morning of the 12th. When I finally began writing, I did not lead with the number, though the number was, by any reasonable measure, the most important fact in the entire report. I led instead with something closer to what I had actually learned, that the Concorde had spent centuries assuming a species could be measured before it had ever truly been tested, and that a single proving trial on a single world had quietly finished undoing a great deal of that assumption in the space of 1 week. In the days that followed, the wider consequences began moving faster than I expected. Formal alliance talks with Earth, previously scheduled to unfold over the following year, were accelerated within days of the Assembly's session. Requests arrived from 3 separate Concorde worlds asking whether additional human recruits might be made available for their own proving grounds, sooner rather than later, given how urgently the greater war against the Hollow Tide required every advantage available. I understand, from later correspondence, that command back on Earth received these requests with a calm that mirrored Daisy's own, treating what the rest of the Concorde considered history-altering news as simply the next item on a growing list of tasks. I later learned, through Bennett, that Earth's own public response to the news was considerably less composed than Command's. Apparently, footage of the trial's final days had been shared, with permission, across Earth's own communication networks, and had been met there with a mixture of pride and disbelief, not so different from our own, though considerably louder. Bennett told me, with clear amusement, that several of Daisy's own family members had reportedly told local reporters that they were not surprised at all, and that one relative had simply said she had always been good at finding things in the woods before anyone else noticed them missing. Within a month, Command had assembled a short list of candidates for the next round of human proving trials, drawn from volunteers across dozens of regions on Earth, each with their own version of the same quiet, practical relationship with difficult ground that Daisy had described to me so plainly. I was permitted to review the list once, briefly, as part of preparing the wider Concord briefing. It included farmers from high, cold valleys, fishers from waters that offered no forgiveness for a careless hour, and more than a few, like Daisy herself, who had simply grown up somewhere that never let its people forget they were not always at the top of the ground they walked on. I found myself wondering, reading it, how many more Vel Ashes across the Concord were about to have their own quiet, steady work turned upside down in exactly the way mine had been. Sethran, for his part, requested a personal meeting with Daisy before she departed the station for her next posting. I was present for it, at his request. He did not offer praise, exactly, though I do not think praise would have suited either of them particularly well. He asked her, instead, a single direct question, the same one he had asked me on the very first night of her trial. He asked what kind of world produces a soldier capable of what she had done, in 7 days, with no armor, no team, and no experience of the planet at all. Daisy considered the question with her usual patience, then answered it more simply than I expected, given how much weight the entire Concord had placed on it. She said Earth was not a soft world, whatever its file might suggest to anyone reading numbers instead of history, and that plenty of people back home had grown up learning the same patient, careful lessons she had, long before any of them ever heard the word Concord. She said the file had measured the wrong things, and that maybe, going forward, it was worth measuring different ones. Sethran did not respond right away. When he finally did, he said only that he intended to recommend exactly that, and thanked her, with what I can only describe as genuine sincerity, for a trial that had taught the Concord considerably more than it had asked her to prove. I think of that exchange often now, in the quiet hours between assignments, when I have time to consider everything the past year has changed. I think, too, about High Proctor Sethran's face in the moment the matriarch fell, a face I had known for years without ever once seeing it look quite like that. I do not think it was only relief. I think it was the particular, unsettled feeling of watching a lifetime of careful assumptions rearrange themselves all at once, the same feeling I had been carrying myself since the 9th minute of the very first day. The Concord spent centuries building careful, patient systems meant to prepare its soldiers for a war that has already cost us 3 entire systems and shows no sign of slowing. Those systems were never wrong, exactly. They were simply built on the assumption that every species needed roughly the same amount of time to become dangerous. Daisy Coleman needed 7 days. I do not know yet what that means for the wider war against the Hollow Tide, whether it means the Concord's timeline for victory has shortened, or whether it simply means we have found one remarkable soldier among an entire species we still barely understand. I suspect, though I cannot yet prove it, that it means something closer to the second possibility, slowly becoming the first, one proving trial at a time, one new human recruit at a time, across however many worlds still wait for their turn. Some nights, when the station is quiet and my own duties have finally settled, I think about the 12 recruit platoon that failed in the Scar 3 years before Daisy ever set foot there, and about how differently that story might have ended if even one of them had spent a full day simply watching before they moved. I do not say this to diminish what they attempted, since courage without pattern is still courage. I say it because Daisy taught me, without ever intending to teach anyone anything at all, that the two are not the same thing, and that a species which has learned to tell them apart carries something far more valuable into a war than claws or armor ever could. For now, I keep the recording of those 7 days close at hand, the way a person keeps something they are still learning to fully believe. I watch the first 9 minutes most often, not because they were the most dangerous moment of the trial, but because they were the first sign of everything that followed, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the rest of us to finally notice it. 9 minutes to prove she belonged in this fight at all. 7 days to prove none of us had understood, until then, exactly what we had been fighting to protect.